Welcome. My name is Haley Soifer, and as CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, or JDCA, I want to thank you all for joining us for today's community conversation, Afghanistan, What Comes Next? Today's discussion comes at a significant and difficult moment, capping what has been a significant and difficult week. We at JDCA, like many of you, are horrified by events in Afghanistan. We're devastated to see the Taliban regain control after 2 decades of American and international sacrifice and war. We are deeply concerned about the future facing the Afghan people, especially women and our Afghan partners whose lives are at risk. And we are deeply saddened to think of the families who have lost loved ones fighting America's longest war, only to see it come an abrupt and difficult end. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers. Despite agreeing with President Biden that we cannot continue to risk lives fighting an endless war. As the president said on Monday, we achieved our goals of degrading al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and preventing another 9/11. And now we must focus our military resources elsewhere on pressing US national security threats. We also agree with him that human rights must continue to be a centerpiece of US foreign policy, and that we must do all we can to ensure the safe and swift evacuation of Americans and our Afghan partners. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by 2 experts who both served in Afghanistan, Representative Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts and Dr. Evelyn Farkas. Our program will be split into 2 parts, each with an opportunity for you to ask questions. So throughout the event, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will do our best to get to all of them. So we will now get on with our program. To introduce today's first guest, I'm delighted to welcome JDCA board member from Massachusetts, Steve Grossman. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Haley, for your continuing leadership during perilous times. Our first guest is the first-term representative from Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District, a former Marine and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. Congressman Jake Achenkloss enlisted in the Marine Corps after graduating from Harvard and went on to serve as an infantry commander in Afghanistan, where he led patrols through villages contested by the Taliban. After serving as part of a special operations unit in Panama, Jake returned home in 2015, where he was elected 3 times to the Newton City Council, and last year won a heavily contested election, succeeding Congressman Joe Kennedy. Since his election, Congressman Auchincloss has been a national security leader in the House, where he also serves as vice chair of the Financial Services Committee. In that role, he authored important consumer protection legislation during his first few months in office. Many of you might not be aware that Jake is a proud member of Boston's Jewish community, and that he and Michelle just welcomed on August 6th a new baby girl, Grace, into their home to join her brother, Teddy. Jake, your constituents, of which I'm one, very much appreciate your leadership on a wide variety of issues of great interest to the Jewish community, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Steve.
And thank you, Congressman, for joining us, and Mazel Tov on welcoming a baby girl. We at JDCA are thrilled to have you join us again, and we are grateful for your leadership as someone who represents our values in Congress. Thank you for your service. Let's start with an understanding of how we got here. Last year, the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban a US military withdrawal that was set to happen in May of this year. President Biden extended this deadline to September 11th of this year. And as we've seen, it occurred even sooner than expected in August. As someone who served in Afghanistan yourself, do you believe it was time, or even past time, for US troops to leave that country after 20 years?
Yes, it was. And I would say that we've got to roll back the clock even farther than February 29th, 2020, when President Trump signed the agreement with the Taliban, which did not include the Afghan government. It was direct US to Taliban accord that unilaterally withdrew American forces. We got to wind our clock back all the way to President Bush. Folks may remember that right after 9/11, President Bush articulated a relatively narrowly scoped counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan, trying to do two things. One was to deny a base of operations to terrorists in Afghanistan, and the second was to bring to justice the architects of 9/11. That counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan was and has continued to be pretty successful, and it's a military mission. But under Bush and Rumsfeld and Cheney, it mutated into a counterinsurgency mission. Now, a counterinsurgency mission is very different than counterterrorism. That is a political initiative with a military component. And to win a counterinsurgency, you have to counter the insurgents with better governance. The Afghan central government was never able to provide that. Corruption and incompetence were endemic to the Afghan bureaucracy. And we saw the consequences of that over the last 2 decades. We poured tens of billions of dollars into their infrastructure and bureaucracy, and ultimately did not have a viable political partner on the other side. So what this president saw when he took office was that he had a stark choice. He could either go big and renege on President Trump's deal with the Taliban and thereby increase by probably an order of magnitude the American military presence in Afghanistan in order to counter the inevitable Taliban push and the resumption of the fighting season, or he could go home and recognize that without a political end game, we would simply be entering a 3rd decade of conflict without any viable long-term solution.
And in a matter of days, the nearly 300,000 member Afghan National Security Army and police dissolved or refused to fight, allowing the country to fall to the Taliban in just 11 days. During your service in Afghanistan, you helped to train this force. They were our partners. Were you surprised by their unwillingness to fight? How do you think this came about based on your experience?
No, I was not surprised, unfortunately. And that's not a reflection, to be clear, on the men and women of the Afghan unit police or the Afghan militia. I patrolled alongside of them. Tactically, they were sound. They cared about their homeland. But imagine being on the front lines and knowing that the United States has built your country an army, has built your country an air force, has invested tens of billions into it. But because of the corruption of your senior command, they can't even get you bullets and rations to the front lines. That type of immoral leadership will crack morale every time. And so I was probably, like most people, somewhat surprised by the sheer horsepower of the Taliban advance, but I was not surprised by the lack of willpower of the Afghan resistance.
And in response to the president's speech this week, you tweeted, "For the first time since 9/11, the commander-in-chief just told the American people the truth about Afghanistan. Counterterrorism is a military mission. Counterinsurgency is a political one. US forces will fight terrorists, but Afghans must fight for Afghanistan." There's a lot to unpack in this tweet. And if you could help us, I know you briefly just touched on it, but could you explain the distinction between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism and between a military and political mission?
Absolutely. And here, Dr. Farkas, I want you to interrupt me if you feel like you've something to add or correct. But I think of counterterrorism as a military mission with a political component. What I mean by that is that the United States retains the prerogative to eliminate terrorists with the imminent will and capacity to strike the US homeland anywhere in the world. So if a country is providing safe harbor to a terrorist, whether it's Nigeria or Sudan or Afghanistan or Pakistan, as we saw with bin Laden, we will neutralize them. We'll neutralize the terrorist threat and extract, and we're going to have to handle the politics along the way because they may be, there's trickiness there. There may be allies. We may have to work with them on their own counterterrorism operations, but fundamentally, this is a pretty well-scoped military mission, and the United States actually is very good at it. We've gotten extremely good at CT over the last 20 years. The cycle time has gotten very fast between operations and intelligence. Counterinsurgency, though, is really about building the apparatus of a nation. It's about countering a one side of a civil war with another side through state building, through a judiciary, through the provision of basic services, through confidence in the rule of law, through confidence in a free press and information. It is an entire exercise in the elements of nationhood. And for that, you really need a political partner. And that was never going to be a viable mission for Americans in Afghanistan without an organic Afghan-led element that could deliver on it.
And if I could just jump in really quickly, since you invited me to, Congressman,
Yes.
I would say that in this sense, it is similar to the Vietnam scenario where we didn't have a government that had won over the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people because it was corrupt and it wasn't delivering for them. And it's different from, say, Colombia, where I was also, when I worked on the Hill, involved in supporting that effort. And in Colombia, we had a strong government that was democratic, that did have the support of the Colombian people, and therefore they did make progress.
Great point.
Touching again on the president's speech on Monday, one of his arguments was that we met our original national security objectives in Afghanistan, and our interests now are elsewhere. So we will move our military resources elsewhere. Do you agree with this assertion? And what steps can be taken to ensure our withdrawal in Afghanistan does not create another safe haven for terrorists, just as it did 20 years ago in the lead up, or it was in the lead up to 9/11? On a related note, can we meet our national security objectives in Afghanistan and elsewhere solely relying on counterterrorism?
So there's a lot there. I'm not sure I can comprehensively answer all of it. A couple of wave top points, though. I think objectively, the counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades has been successful. We've prevented any attacks on the U.S. homeland from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden is dead. But counterterrorism, I mean, every morning you wake up and it's a new mission. And so we've got to be keeping a close eye on Al-Qaeda affiliated prisoners who were released from Bagram Air Base, for example. And we need to assure the Taliban that that we retain the right to strike terrorist training camps or terrorists themselves anywhere in their country. So that mission is ongoing. It's gone well the last 20 years. We need to make sure it continues to go well. On the president's larger point that we need to redirect our resources and our attention elsewhere, yes, I agree with that. I think most national security thinkers these days would agree that the true 21st century competition is in the Indo-Pacific between the United States and China, and that we need our focus and our bandwidth directed there, particularly in the South China Sea. And that fighting a protracted land war in Central Asia is going to bleed out both attention and resources from that larger struggle. The final thing I want to say, though, and as tempting as it can be to draw stark lessons from the legacy, is that this is messy, right? So counterinsurgency did not succeed in Afghanistan. I don't think anybody can assert that. And yet literacy rates are twice what they were when the United States came there. Infant mortality is half what it was when the United States came there. Access to electricity went up by 3 or 4 times. There are 10 times as many kids in school as there were when we arrived, including 40% of them as young girls. The Taliban are taking back the country, but they're taking back a different country, and they may have to adapt to the country that they are now governing, rather than forcing the country to adapt to them entirely.
Very good points. Now shifting to Congress, what can be done in terms of support of the United States for the people of Afghanistan? We are going to talk a bit more about refugees with Dr. Farkas later in the program. But while we still have you, there has been some talk about adding additional funding for special immigrant visas or SIVs into the reconciliation package that you all will be voting on shortly. What is the state of those discussions, and is that the right place to put this kind of support for Afghans?
So I think we're going to hear within hours, maybe days, from the administration about programs for, excuse me, the evacuation and resettlement of refugees, the funding that they need Congress is going to support. I'm very confident of that. I certainly will, whether it's reconciliation or another vehicle, we'll get it done. We've already streamlined the special immigrant visa program. It's still a little bit cumbersome. I would, though, there's been a little bit of a push from some members of Congress and some advocates that scrap the entire paperwork and process and just send them over. Let's be a little careful with that. Remember, we just are getting reports that a bunch of Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists were freed from Bagram Air Base. They would like nothing better than to get airlifted out of the United States, airlifted to the United States. So the bureaucracy and the paperwork is cumbersome, but it's there for a reason.
Great. And our final question is lessons learned. I'm sure you've thought about this, especially because you yourself served and sacrificed for this war. But what lessons can be learned from our withdrawal and essentially the events of the past week in Afghanistan? And what are the implications for U.S. foreign policy going forward?
So I know that there's, I was just looking at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page, and it is just a roster of Armageddon scenarios for the United States. That's 7 or 8 different op-eds saying how it's all over now. I don't buy it. I think the world is hungry for American leadership on transnational threats like climate change, on public health, of course, on counterterrorism. And to the extent that we can deliver on those, our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and was it a perfectly crisply executed withdrawal? No, it was not, is not going to detract from American global or moral leadership. I think the world understands that we need to focus on the geostrategic and transnational priorities of the 21st century. In terms of lessons learned, it's not going to be, I'm not sure I'm going to add any incredibly insightful points here. Don't start wars that you don't understand how they end. The next time a Bush-like president tries to blunder and bluster their way into a protracted war, and they can't explain what you're trying to achieve in very crisp, simple terms, people like me in Congress, others outside of Congress, we need to stand up. And we need to ask much harder questions at the beginning than we are asking at the end. And to that point, I just want to say, the Washington Post has done a service with their Afghanistan Papers project. The declassification using FOIA of the Special Inspector General's report on the Afghanistan reconstruction has really laid bare just the dissembling and lying, frankly, that occurred in the US national security establishment over the last 20 years to allow this to proceed. The single most important failure of decision-making in situation after situation room was sunk cost bias. More time, more troops, more treasure, give us just another year and we'll get it done. And this president deserves a tremendous amount of credit for having the integrity to say no more. It's not going to be glorious, but I am going to look to the national interest and get us out of here.
Great. Well, we know that that you have to go, Congressman. We're incredibly grateful for your time, for your insight, for your leadership, and for your service.
Thanks for having me on. It's always good to speak with the JDC.
You too. Thank you for joining us. Okay, now we are going to go to our next speaker, Dr. Evelyn Farkas. We will now shift the conversation slightly to look at some of the humanitarian aspects of what we are now facing. And I actually just want to briefly mention that when I served in the Senate, as Dr. Farkas did, I actually traveled to Afghanistan a few times between 2009 and 2011, which was the same time that you were in Afghanistan, Dr. Farkas. You served in Jalalabad as an election observer. But just to give a bit more background, Dr. Farkas is a seasoned national security and foreign policy expert with 3 decades of experience in the U.S. executive, legislative branches, as well as the private sector and international organizations. During the Obama administration, she served first as senior advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, and later as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, where she often weighed in on policy on Afghanistan. She also oversaw the Afghanistan policy for almost a decade when serving as a senior staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Dr. Farkas also appears frequently on MSNBC and NBC as a national security advisor and is currently the president of Farkas Global Strategies. So, Evelyn, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I want to give you a few minutes to reflect, as someone who's worked on this policy for decades, on the events of the past week and what this means for us going forward.
Thank you very much, Haley, to you and to JDCA. I actually did have the pleasure of appearing before some of your audience when I was running for Congress in New York, unsuccessfully. So I'm back on the foreign policy beat. I think, what I wanted to reflect on are a couple of things. One, in the United States, we have a tendency to think that we have to solve problems and win wars. And I think, when the congressman talked about things are messy and we'll see what happens, it's really important to remember that what we really should be considering when we engage in conflict, or really more importantly, in foreign policy issues, is that we want to manage them. We don't really want to solve them. And so the question really was, how do we best manage the situation in Afghanistan going forward? And it was clear to many people, myself included, that we needed to withdraw our large military commitment, that was no longer tenable. It wasn't achieving our objectives, as the congressman said. But at the same time, there are many different ways to manage the situation in Afghanistan going forward. And we missed an opportunity to do it better using diplomacy. Again, starting with the decisions that were made under the Trump administration, although of course the roots in that have something to do with the corrupt and unpopular Ghani government, which is, I suspect, why the Trump administration found it easy to just leave them out of the discussions. So I think going forward, it's really important to think about what is the best way to manage the situation. And oftentimes you're buying time and space. If we had done a better job of easing this transition, we could have bought some time and space to get more people out safely, to negotiate maybe with the Taliban, which we're going to still have to do, to try to get them to agree to be good to their word. I mean, they're saying right now that they're going to defend human rights, which nobody believes. But, in diplomacy, you try to hold people's, leaders' feet to the fire, and you try to see what you can get them to agree to on paper. And then you dole out the punishments and the rewards accordingly. So I think that's one main point that I wanted to make. And then the other one really is, you talked about it when you mentioned the refugees. I have been really heartened by how Americans, while they do agree largely and have agreed largely that we need to get out of Afghanistan, they understand the commitment to the Afghans who supported us in our international efforts there. And I really have been heartened by the advocacy that's come out of, for example, Westchester, which was my district where I ran for Congress. I've had organizations contact me over a month ago asking for advice and help to get some of the special immigrant visas accelerated. So that was interesting to me, just to note that people who aren't foreign policy wonks, who aren't in the DC bubble, who were really concerned about our commitment. And it went beyond veterans. And so I'll just mention really quickly, since you've given me the floor, that the organization that contacted me was the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration. And so anyone who's interested in what they do, they work closely with HIAS and other national organizations. But if you're in Westchester, give them your support. And then for those who want to help in their community to do resettlement of the Afghans, I've been told that if you go to the website find.usahello.org and you type in where you live, you can find out which organization has the lead. So for example, in the DC, Virginia, Maryland area, it's the Lutheran Church. So if you have furniture or you have an apartment you can offer, or other things they need, you can do that there locally. And I think also donate money. So I'll just leave it at that. But I wanted to really say, I'm the child of political refugees who fled communist Hungary because of, frankly, a botched US foreign policy where we encouraged the Hungarians to revolt against the Soviets. They did, and then the Soviets came back to kill them. And so the United States and our democratic allies in the West said, oh boy, we better let these people have political asylum. And so my parents came to the United States. So I feel very strongly about reaching out and helping those people to whom we have a moral responsibility.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. We have a lot of questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to start by just asking a few based on your experience, and then we will dive into those audience questions. So keep them coming. The first is that I had mentioned in your intro that you worked in Afghanistan as an election observer in 2009. So this was the second election in the post-Taliban era. It was not without problems, including reports of fraud, and there was supposed to be a runoff. It never happened. What was the state of Afghanistan's democracy before the Taliban takeover? And now, what kind of government will it have under Taliban rule?
I think the state of the democracy, sort of at the political level, at the highest levels, was really rotten, right? President Ghani did not have the support of the Afghan people. Even before that, in 2009, when we brokered an agreement between Hamid Karzai and Abdullah, which is basically, two big ethnic groups and warlords, etc., that also didn't have the support widely of the Afghan people. Where democracy existed and continues to exist, I think, is sort of in the civil society. Of course, many of those people are now fighting for their lives and may end up leaving Afghanistan, so we don't know how much of that will remain and how much will be allowed to persist. But we were effective in, as the congressman said, training a cadre of people, teaching them what it meant to be members of a democratic society. So even though Afghanistan didn't really function like a strong, uncorrupt democratic society, there were lots of organizations, sports organizations, women's organizations, all of the things that go into making a strong democracy that existed and that were real and heartfelt and not corrupt. And there were a lot of women who were propelled into leadership positions. Unfortunately, none of them made it, into the office of the presidency, because maybe history in the future will be better when you can get those types of leaders into positions. But with the United States there, I think we also probably contributed to the corruption and to the lack of an ability to take responsibility for that younger generation, because the older ones were being supported by us and essentially locked into place.
You also served as a senior advisor to the EUCOM commander and as a special advisor to the Secretary of Defense, including at the NATO summit. So you worked a lot with our international allies, including NATO, which was serving alongside us in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. We've been talking a lot in the past week about the US military role and US sacrifice, but describe the international role and specifically the role of NATO in fighting alongside the United States for the past 20 years in Afghanistan.
Right. So I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, although I was just reading NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg's comments that he made today he gave a very frank, open press conference on the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The NATO allies, of course, are just as shocked as we are by the speed of the Taliban advance and by the consequences. They are evacuating their nationals as well as the Afghans who helped them. The NATO allies were in there with us. We had a huge coalition of NATO allies. In fact, we had a lot of non-NATO countries as well. Many of the aspirant countries that are now members, like Montenegro and North Macedonia, were there actively helping us out. And we also had, of course, non-NATO allies as well. Turkey continues to have a very big role, and we will see into the future how we can work with Turkey. NATO itself it continues to search for a way that they can be active politically. And I think ultimately that's going to be the question coming up in the near future in terms of political military reality, because the Taliban may not be able to control Afghanistan. There are pockets of Afghanistan right now. The Panjshir Valley is not under Taliban control. And in fact, the son of the late Massoud, the leader who was killed right before the attack on 9/11, he and others in the Panjshir Valley are saying to the Taliban, we will not give up control unless you share power with us. So I think there will be more struggles in Afghanistan, to include armed struggles over power. And we see that, Afghan citizens went out in Jalalabad, the place where I was an election monitor, and demonstrated. So the consolidation of power is an area where the Taliban is challenged. And I think the international community can weigh in to help those weaker actors, because the Taliban at some point will need money. Although we should note that some of the neighbors are perfectly happy to work with the Taliban and provide them with funding, and in fact, may have done so in the run-up to where we are today.
Great. We will now go into some of our audience questions. So do continue to post them, and please include your name. Janice asks the following. Perhaps this is naive, but the Taliban are already telling the Afghan population there will be no reprisals, attempting to calm the situation, which seems appropriate. And according to the news, they've been asking the public employees, including women, to return to work. Why have they not also told foreigners, including Americans, that there's no need to evacuate? And how would you advise the United States to engage with the Taliban moving forward? Can we take them at their word?
So Janice, we cannot take them at their word. They have a track record of being, the grossest violators of human rights. We've all seen them stoning and shooting women. The past in the 90s was horrible. And in fact, there are reports in Afghanistan today of reprisals. That uprising that I mentioned, the demonstration in Jalalabad, was met with force, put down by force by the Taliban. So they are already violating human rights. There are also reports of women and girls being taken as forced brides by Taliban. Now, part of the problem is that you have the Taliban leadership saying one thing, and they very likely don't control all of the rank and file. And certainly, I'm guessing they probably can't control all of those crazy people they let out of the prisons. So there is a problem with discipline. Even if the Taliban wanted to control their rank and file, it would be a challenge. But I don't think we can take them at their word. We have to assume the worst. And the fact that the Taliban, I just watched the Pentagon press conference earlier today, the fact that the Taliban is not allowing people to move freely to Kabul if they want to leave Afghanistan, obviously isn't a good sign. So they're not saying, oh, well, if you help the US forces in Jalalabad or in another part of Afghanistan, Mazar-e Sharif, and you want to go to Kabul because that's the only airport where the internationals are flying you out, go ahead, we'll make sure you get there safely. They're not doing that. I don't know, it sounds like our government, our military has been requesting that, or if they haven't, they have a reason not to be requesting that. I don't know, it's unclear at this moment, but again, we are not getting the signs that the Taliban is interested in, protecting human rights.
We have a question from Lynn about the Afghan military and police. The Afghan forces have lost about 70,000 people fighting this war with the US objectives, and the US government has been clear-eyed about their challenges and weaknesses, yet they fell far more quickly at the moment when desperate Afghans who will suffer the greatest were clinging to every word from the US. Now, what is your view about the strength or weaknesses we've seen of the Afghan army and police? And why do you think that the president, as we heard in his remarks on Monday, has really stuck to this talking point of essentially saying now the Afghans need to fight for themselves?
So I think embedded in your question was part of the answer, because the reality is that the Afghan forces, military, police, they depended on the United States military, and their will was largely derived from the knowledge that they had our backing. And once they saw that not only were we going to leave by August 31st, but we started pulling out already in May and accelerated the process, it caused, I think, a real crisis in confidence. And, you know, while they never had much confidence in their government, all of a sudden they were being poorly resupplied, was my understanding from reading in newspaper accounts. And they didn't feel that they had the support of their commanders, much less, you know, even if the commanders were supported, Kabul. And so I think, but really, the United States was a lot of the backbone for them of political will. And in Afghanistan, they have a long history of switching sides. If they see the other side is winning, they'll switch sides. And that's essentially what happened in this case.
Got it. Peter has asked or said, to me, the main question is whether the timing of the withdrawal could and should have been handled better, assuming a more orderly withdrawal and efforts to protect our Afghan allies were in place, as well as efforts to protect Americans on the ground. What is your response?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I agree completely. Yes, we had to leave Afghanistan. We had to withdraw our large military presence, but we did not have to do it this way. We knew enough to know we had to get our Afghan supporters out because we figured pretty clearly, and they were telegraphing to us that they would be in danger. And yet the US bureaucracy, Congress included, dragged its heels. That's why I was getting those calls from the refugee organization in Westchester saying, can you help? We're trying to accelerate this process. It's overly bureaucratized. And when I called over to the Hill, sure enough, that's what I found out. But the executive branch should have been essentially, you know, passing executive orders, taking action so that all of that bureaucracy, the paperwork, was expedited or not even required. I mean, I've heard other accounts saying that we had enough information and we had biometrics on many of these special immigrant visa candidates we could have used. So we knew enough to know that we needed to be prepared to take thousands of people out of Afghanistan to safety. And that's a process we could have started, frankly, years ago. But, you know, as soon as we knew that we were going to leave, as soon as the president was sworn into office, there should have been a full press to at least get into motion and create a list and an orderly departure schedule for those individuals. Of course, there's always a little bit of tension because you don't want to completely cripple, you know, what's left at the end. But those people wanted to leave. We had declared that we would, you know, we had a commitment to them that we would help them leave. And so we should have been doing that. In addition, understanding that the situation was as fragile as it was, we should not have conducted our withdrawal so fast. And I think we also, when we let the contractors leave, who were providing assistance to the Afghan forces in the form of logistics assistance, that was also a failure, but obviously it was a failure building upon the failure of the Afghan military, frankly, to supply their troops effectively.
So now that we are here, there's no question that our Afghan partners, including those who served as translators, are at risk. So what more can be done to secure the lives of the most vulnerable, including those translators? We've mentioned the special immigrant visas, and Congress passed legislation regarding the SIVs a few weeks ago, but there are some, and including many refugees, who are not covered by those specific visas. So what else can be done by the administration as well as Congress in order to ensure that they can quickly get out of the country and ideally come to the United States?
Yeah. I think we need to take a page from other situations like this, where we had hundreds of thousands of political refugees who deserve to get asylum in the West because of their support, either directly or indirectly, of democracy or of our intervention in their country. What do I mean by that? Well, frankly and concretely, President Biden should convene a group of states, an international committee to address the refugee situation. We need to take everyone who wants political asylum out of the country as fast as we can, and then from another location, figure out which countries will take them, and then resettle them. That's what we did in 1956 after the failure of the Hungarian Revolution. And yes, while I understand what the congressman said about the need to make sure that we don't, allow terrorists into our country, I think we can do that and stay true to our values. So, we have international agreement on political asylum and what that means and what rights people have to political asylum. And so we should abide by that and take as many Afghans out who are seeking political asylum. So not just the interpreters who helped our military officers, but also people who worked for media, Afghan media or US or international media, people who worked on human rights, even if they weren't working directly for any international organization. If they are in harm's way because of their activities, political activities, then they are candidates for political asylum.
But as we know, there's a lag, right? The United States has screening in place. There's a whole process. They have to fill out their paperwork. It takes time. Is there a way for the administration to expedite this process?
I think that the president can, by executive order, say, you don't need to have all that paperwork. And then you move everyone to a location where they can be screened. Obviously, they don't get on any planes, trains, or automobiles with weaponry. So if they are a sleeper terrorist, you're going to have to figure that out later down the line, but they won't be of harm to anyone while they're getting out of the country. You have to be willing to accept a little bit of risk. I mean, that's essentially what we did in 1956. There could have been some bad eggs, in the bunch, but we let them into the camps in Austria first, and then from Austria they were taken to other countries. They were processed and taken to other countries. So you just need to get them somewhere safe where you can process them.
Nancy's just asked, how are you going to get them out? Those who want to leave with the Taliban controlling the streets. It looks like we now, and you mentioned you just watched the press briefing from the Pentagon today. It looks like we now do have control of the airport and evacuation flights have resumed. But how will people get from their homes to the airport?
It's a huge problem, Nancy. So if they're in Kabul, they can go to the airport, and there are gates, they're calling them, that are open to the airport where they're processing people. The Secretary of Defense and General Milley gave the numbers per gate, something like 300 at one gate and I don't know how many hundred at the other one per hour. That's great. So they clearly have a process that's working. The problem is, I think not everyone feels like they can safely make it to a gate. The people who can safely make it to a gate are people who can waive a passport of another country. If you don't have a passport of another country and you're a woman, you're taking on a lot of risk to get to that gate. And that's just Kabul. Everyone else, frankly speaking, is on their own. If you're out in, like I said, in Mazar-e-Sharif or Herat or who knows where, you have to figure out a way to get through a bunch of Taliban checkpoints and to the airport in Kabul, and then face that same line at the gate. So and getting to Kabul is really dangerous because they're looking for people who are working with the government. The reports are that they have been taking lists and taking information, and they are looking for people who helped the international community. So it's very risky to put your life in danger to try to get to Kabul. Some people have been doing it. I saw something recently where a family did it, but they may have had some paperwork or something from an American or an international. And so again, I don't know what we're going to do, because part of the questioning that the reporters, very tough questioning they gave to the Pentagon briefers was exactly this: are you going to do anything to help these people get to Kabul? If we don't, then in effect we're saying too bad, so sad, and that's that's a hard one to swallow.
There have been some fake stories about kidnapping of young women. Jill is asking about this. Could you speak to that? There are reports. I mean, there's just disinformation everywhere about so many things. But can you speak to some of the fake news stories that are circulating about Afghanistan?
That's a really good question. I am not aware of those fake stories. I think we need to be really, really careful. That's why I look very closely, not at what's on Twitter. I mean, I look at it, it's interesting, and I tweet, but I really want to see what are the reporters who are on the ground, what are the journalists, who are on TV, on the ground there saying, our opponents, America's opponents, the democratic world's opponents, will certainly use disinformation to try to take advantage of the situation. And the Taliban, of course, also is, masterful at disinformation. So I think it's good to have some healthy skepticism. And again, I think you have to look to what has history and experience told us, for example, about the Taliban. So it's easier to believe that they have committed new atrocities against women and girls because of their past than it is to believe that they suddenly, are ready to allow women to stay in the Afghan parliament. They need to prove themselves. And as far as disinformation is concerned, again, I think we just all need to be vigilant about it and point it out when we can identify it, or ask people who are really grounded in the reality in Afghanistan to vet bad disinformation or vet information, period.
We have a question from Amy about Ashraf Ghani. You had mentioned the unpopularity of leaving out the Ghani government from negotiations that the Trump administration had with the Taliban last year. But it, according to Amy, it doesn't sound as if any transition plan was in place for this government to be able to take over and actually govern. Was that actually the case? And does Ghani have any credibility left? Can he still help Afghanistan from the outside? And we heard today that he has arrived in the UAE.
I think he has no credibility left. I mean, he ran for his life. He may very well have been a huge impediment to coming up with a practical solution for the political situation or political military situation in Afghanistan. I mean, the Taliban effectively seized power using military force, but they're still not recognized by the international community. And you're right, Amy, that is a huge gap. I wonder myself how the Biden administration got to the point where we are today. I guess they were still trying to negotiate while they were withdrawing, which seems a bit unstrategic, because when you are not, I mean, when you're negotiating and you want an outcome, you want to use your maximum leverage and keep your leverage at the max. So they may have miscalculated about how much leverage they had, and certainly they miscalculated about how much leverage the Taliban had, right? The Taliban, now we know, could conquer the country in 11 days using military force. So they could shrug at the diplomatic, discussions and say, who cares? We're going to win this using force. The thing is that they haven't won anything. I mean, yes, they're notionally in control, but again, they're not internationally recognized, and history didn't stop today, right? So let's see, I mean, can they govern? Can they maintain control of this territory? What will the opponents to the Taliban do, like, as I mentioned, the leaders in the Panjshir Valley? How will this unfold? And if it becomes chaotic, the neighboring countries aren't going to tolerate it either. And some of them are quite nervous about the Taliban, although they're shaking hands with them. And I'm thinking Beijing right now. So I think there are a lot of open questions, but clearly there was a massive diplomatic failure. We did not manage the transition. We did not plan for the transition, not just operationally, but politically. You're right. It appears there was no transition.
And we will end our last question, but I would encourage everyone to stay on, because we will at the very end talk about ways that all of you can get involved and help the people of Afghanistan. But our last question for you, Evelyn, is very similar to what we asked Congressman. What are some lessons learned in terms of the limits of U.S. military power? And frankly, should we have left years ago? Was 20 years too long for this war?
Well, 20 years was too long for this war, yes. Should we have left sooner? Yes. But I still have a lot of questions. Ultimately, you need a political solution. And by solution, I go back to what I said at the beginning, something that manages the situation, we have a political band-aid, a management of the standoff between North and South Korea that is guaranteed by a deterrent force, a deterrent military force of 28,500 men and women, right? That working with a combined relationship with the South Korean armed forces. So that is a situation where we've managed it. We found a political agreement that could be backed up by military force that was enough of a deterrent that we, knock on wood, haven't seen a resumption of war since the end of the Korean War. So that's what you should be looking for as a leader of your country. You're not going to necessarily solve a problem. And I think part of the real issue was somewhere along the way with this counterinsurgency objective, we started to get excited about, transforming Afghanistan as a society. And that really should not have been our mission and our objective. Our objective should have been, frankly speaking, another place where I worked in a post-conflict situation was Bosnia. Bosnia has a crazy political situation right now. It's not very healthy, but guess what? It's kept the peace. I mean, for as much as people want to, complain today about how dysfunctional Bosnia is, which is true, the political arrangement that led to the end of war in Bosnia has held. So it's managed it. That Band-Aid has worked. So I think at the end of the day, what we should aim for is a Band-Aid, not a perfect solution, but something that will buy time. And the only thing we have to make sure is that the buying of time doesn't solidify a bad dynamic. And that is, of course, where the rub is, in Bosnia and other places. But I think if you can stop a war, that's your first imperative.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight with all of us. It's deeply appreciated. We're now going to hear from Bobby Saperstein, our program director, who will give us all some next steps in terms of actions that we can all take to make a difference in terms of this crisis. Over to you, Bobby.
Thank you, Haley, and to thank you to Representative Auchincloss and Dr. Farkas for joining us, and for all of you at home who are supporting JDCA and partook in today's incredibly important and incredibly urgent community conversation on Afghanistan and what comes next. Right now, as we mentioned throughout the program, there's a number of organizations offering ways to help with evacuation and resettlement. And some of those include HIAS, No One Left Behind, Women for Afghan Women, the International Refugee Assistance Project, the Westchester Jewish Coalition for Immigration, find.usahello.org. And these are just a few to name right now. If you have other suggestions or know of other places, please post them in the chat and we will collect them and then disseminate them. Please visit all of these organizations' websites to learn more about what you can do to help out right now. We also encourage you to visit our website at jewishdems.org and implore you to help us take action by demanding that Congress include emergency funding for Afghan refugees to the budget package. While there, you can learn about how to join our JDCA membership program and how to join one of our 16 state and local JDCA chapters and events, including one tonight. JDCA's California chapters are going to be hosting a phone bank to help us stop the recall of Governor Gavin Newsom, driven by conspiracy theorists, Trump supporters, anti-vaxxers. It's kind of unbelievable to think that it's going to be as close of a vote as it is, but we need your help. The phone bank will take place tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, and will feature remarks by Assemblymember Jesse Gabriel, who is the chair of the Legislative Jewish Caucus, and it will be held in partnership with Grassroots Dems HQ. As the situation in Afghanistan continues to unfold, we'll keep you posted over the next number of days, weeks, and months about how we can all be most helpful. For now, please visit the websites of those organizations we listed before. Time is running out to bring those at risk to safety and to ensure that those who are left behind remain safe, secure, and are never forgotten. Those that are there may be in hiding, but they're desperately listening to the world, and we must respond. Thank you all again for joining us. We look forward to seeing you later tonight and again at all of our upcoming JDCA events. Take care and stay safe.